Hello everyone, welcome back. This is episode 16 of our Creative Minecraft series. This one was a lot of fun to make, although there were some behind the scenes stuff that made this episode take a lot longer than I thought it would. But anyways, this episode is going to be about the waterfront. As I said in other episodes, it's specifically the waterfront on the southern side of the city. And of course, I wanted to talk a little bit about waterfronts in this episode, right? Waterfronts, their primary purpose over time has changed quite a lot. And Newport, of course, the city, is not any exception. But before we get too into the topic of discussion today, time for recommendations. Everyone's favorite segment, or at least I hope it is. So the movie today is a little bit different. It's Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland. I love that film. Honestly, defining film of my childhood. I still love it. I still watch it consistently. It's so good. I mean, it's Tim Burton, so obviously it's going to be good, but it's amazing, especially if you've ever seen the original Disney Alice in Wonderland. Not gonna lie, not a huge fan of it. It's kind of weird. And I get that Alice in Wonderland is supposed to be weird, but it's so weird that it kind of feels pointless to watch. It's like, what am I watching? I don't know. It's confusing. But I feel like Tim Burton's at least is still weird, but it has a plot. Like, you can actually watch it and be like, oh, this is a movie and not a bizarre collection of random events, you know? The book for today is Design is Storytelling by Ellen Lupton, written in 2017, or at least that's what I found on the book. I don't have it with me. It's in the other room. I was rereading it because I was looking for books to recommend, and I saw it on my coffee table, believe it or not, and I was like, oh, wait, yeah. It's a book that originally I read for an art class my first semester in college, but I just really enjoyed it. I thought it was very funny. It's some of the humor is a little bit on the adult side, I will admit. It can, stretch a little bit further. I wouldn't recommend anyone under the age of senior year in high school reading it. It's not like explicit, but it's meant for a college student, if that makes sense. But I genuinely think, even if you're not like a design nerd, I think it brings up a lot of interesting points that maybe you didn't think about. Like, it talks about the storytelling aspect of designing a store, so to speak. Like, if you think about how IKEA or Walmart, why they lay out things where they do, they're trying to get you to go through the store in a certain way in order to buy as many things as possible, right? Goods that people are more likely to buy impulsively are going to be front and center in the aisles. You're going to find a lot of candy and kids products lower down where kids can see them and ask their parents for them. You're going to find the everyday items that people most frequent at the back of the store, like they're the hardest to get to, things like milk, dairy, eggs, things like that, like basic goods that people need all the time. They're always at the back of the store because they want you to have to walk past everything and think, ooh, but maybe I do need a Ritz cracker today or something like that. The idea is they want you to buy as much as possible, so they do storyboard how people are going to walk through their layout. They might make it intentionally confusing to keep you around longer. They might force you to walk further to get to the things that you're more likely to want. But either way, that's how they're doing this. That's kind of the thing this book talks about, and other stuff, but vaguely within that realm of design, and design in many aspects, and how it relates to storytelling, and how design is a story. It's a very interesting read. Definitely recommend. But moving on to the topic at hand, right? Today we're talking about waterfronts, the history of waterfronts, how that relates to my city here in Minecraft. And, what to think about when you're designing a waterfront for your city, if you're doing a waterfront city. Now, the important thing to really, obviously, to just broadenly, right, we think about ports. Originally, all ports were cargo ports. Well, for the most part, right? If they aren't new, they're meant for cargo, ultimately, right? All ports would import goods and export goods. I mean, it's in the name, right? And a lot of times you'd have industry nearby. So if you look at old New York, old London, basically any city that's on the coast. Heck, old Los Angeles used to have oil drills on the coast. But of course, nowadays, right, most ports are focused, depending on where you are, but most waterfronts near cities and urban centers are places for like tourism or green space or like transit, right? You think like cruise ships or that kind of thing. There are still cargo ports in the world, but they're a lot more dedicated spaces. Whereas in the past, like if you look at old photos of New York, because, that's our main inspiration. So we're going to be going back to New York a lot here. But if you look at the past in New York, you'll see that there is a lot of, there's a lot of ships. There's a lot of, like, in a sense, like kind of warehouses and factories near the port. And especially when you go back to the colonial days or like shortly after the Revolutionary War, there was a lot of like fishing industry and things like that. Well, there was a lot of fishing for a while, but the point being that ultimately ports and waterfronts went from primarily cargo and industrial uses to, over time, a lot of cities transitioning these spaces into tourist spaces, right? So that you can walk along the waterfront, so that you can, do whatever it is that people do. Like here I have basketball courts and there's parks and green space to lay out and things like that. And I'm not totally completed with this in this episode. I had to kind of rush some things at the end here just because, stuff's going on. I have graduations I have to go to, and I'm cooking for a graduation party and family's coming, so it's a lot of cooking. Already made banana bread, you might have seen on my Instagram, and I'm making carrot cake today and multiple sides, and my mom's making burgers. So, it's a whole thing. Sorry to get too distracted. We'll get back to the point. Okay, the point being, this city's no exception. It's similar. That's how it's going. Didn't get all of it done that I wanted to, but I will be working on that when I get back from my trip this next week. So you're going to be missing me this next week, probably. I might make something this weekend and have it scheduled to post while I'm gone. If nothing comes up, that didn't work out. So you may not be seeing me this next week. You may see a little bit of me next week from this coming weekend. Who knows? We'll see how it goes. I'm going to be really busy tomorrow because tomorrow is when I'm going to my sister's graduation and having the graduation party. So yeah, it's going to be a whole thing. But anyways, so let's talk about, right, the history of New York Harbor, right? New York Harbor had a lot of cargo. It was one of the busiest ports in America, one of arguably most important. And because it was so important, New York became an incredibly dense, incredibly large city. Even now, New York is the largest city in America, right? With over 3 million people living in Manhattan alone, and within the greater New York area, I think it's closer to 10 million people. It's by far the most populated area in America, and as far as I've ever heard, it's the most dense city in America. Probably one of the most dense cities in North America. I know it's not the most dense city in North America, but it is the densest city in America, as far as I've ever heard. And another example, I think I mentioned it briefly, Los Angeles had oil fields on its beach, right? So, this is a thing that wasn't just East Coast or like specifically really old cities in America, but it's something that all cities kind of saw, that there was a lot of industry on waterfronts. Waterfronts weren't really seen as necessary for green space, not yet anyways. That the idea, we didn't even get like national parks or state parks until like the mid to later half of the 19th century. So there was a good like almost 100 years where America was just building all of these industries and factories along rivers, and we weren't really thinking about what we were doing to the environment or these beautiful places. Heck, Niagara Falls nowadays is a state park, but back in the day they just built like factories along it along a waterfall. Could you imagine? It was ugly, it was gross, not great places to be. We didn't really treasure nature in the way we do now. We still have issues now, to be sure, but we're doing a lot better about, actually getting on top of it and trying to clean things out. But I want to talk about, how did we transition? Because obviously going a transition from building factories along Niagara Falls to having basketball fields and tourist attractions along the water, like Ferris wheels and things like that, that's a big leap. When you think about it, like, how did we go? Well, we don't want to go quite there yet, but we're going to talk about the next development in cargo ports, which was the invention of trains, and trains coming into these port areas to deliver and receive goods. because for a lot of history, right, a port was supplied by horse and buggy, right, carts and horses. So you built infrastructure and architecture that matched that. But after a while, once we got trains, all of that infrastructure completely had to change, because trains don't work in the same way horses do. They're a lot more efficient, but they can't turn right angles, so they need a lot more space. So you started to see rail yards being along waterfronts in certain places. And if we look at Seattle has these very unique, interesting piers. And you may wonder why some cities have piers that are straight and others don't. Well, if they're not straight, like in San Francisco or in Seattle, that's almost always going to be because there used to be a train line running along the waterfront that had to curve into the piers so that the trains could actually get in, because again, they can't make 90-degree turns, so they would have to curve in at as deep as an angle as they could, and thus creating this very interesting architecture mimicking that. So if you are building a city in Minecraft, that's something to think about. Like, when did the port in your city become really big, right? When did the industry, right? New York's port became really big long time before trains, so it was really hard for them to change that. They didn't really change that, so you see a lot of straight piers because it would have been horse and buggies back in the day, at least, right? They added trains to the waterfront, moving along streets, and then eventually the High Line, down the road, because trains were just efficient. You had to do that, but they had to work really hard to try to work with really old infrastructure to accommodate new technology, because old infrastructure doesn't always accommodate new technology. It doesn't always work out. Whereas Seattle didn't really start developing until later, and didn't get a big port presence until later, so they were able to build from the get-go infrastructure that supported trains. But of course, things would change yet again, right? Especially in New York, with the invention of one specific thing, the cargo container, invented in 1956. It completely revolutionized shipping across the world. All ports in the world, prior to shipping containers, unified shipping containers, you'd have different containers for everything, right? Every country that would export a good might have a different crate for every good. Every company, right? If you think about all the companies in America, imagine if every company shipped you something in a completely different material, different shape and size, and so how you designed early trucks, how you designed trains, how you designed roads, how you designed ships was completely different, and different because you had to be able to accommodate a vast array of differently shaped things to go into the space. But with the invention of shipping containers, it made the whole process really efficient. It made building trucks and trains and ships really efficient, because now you have a standard, right? There's one shipping container, has one size, it fits all, right? It makes sense, because now shipping large cargo ships can be invented because you can have standards. But for cities like New York, Seattle, basically any city that existed before 1956, it sent huge shockwaves through the system, because it's really hard to fit something that now has a standard into a system that never had one, right? It's that, again, it's going back to that idea that you have infrastructure that cannot accommodate this new technology, and it hit New York really hard. New York had a lot of economic issues from between the 60s and 80s. A lot of people ended up leaving the cities for many reasons, but a lot of the job loss from the ports closing down was one thing. And you'll notice occasionally in this video, and especially at the end flyover, that I have that kind of rotting dock, and that is kind of something left over from that era, right? Because Newport would have gone through the same idea. In my head, it would have gone through the same transition, where as shipping containers got invented and as ports needed to change in order to accommodate them, you now needed storage to hold cargo containers, right? Because you can't just build a barrel. It has to be in a container, because that's how things get shipped, right? So you had to have completely new infrastructure, and so a lot of the old stuff just ended up getting left to rot, literally, just left there. And of course, I do want to build a cargo port later on. It's not going to be on the landmass that has Newport on it. It's going to be on the south side of the river, so a little bit disconnected, but within like the same state boundaries technically. It's going to be in the greater like Newport region, kind of like New York with its Brooklyn harbors and things. But it is going to be, it's going to be in the future, a little bit ways away, probably quite a ways away, but you never know. We'll see. But ultimately, I wanted to get all of this across to you guys and tell you about the history of waterfronts, not just because it's interesting, but because most cities in the world do front the ocean. It's something that's really important to talk about. How does your city interact with the water, right? Is it beaches and hotels? Is it, cargo ports, or is it old cargo ports that are rotting away and falling apart, ports that aren't taken care of anymore? That's kind of the way it is in Newport, but with a little bit of renewal, some renewal projects, which kind of leads us into the new, right? It's that touristy kind of, vaguely touristy, but still semi-industrialness, right? Where it's clear that this was built for ships back in the day, but has been retrofitted over time through different projects, trying to clean the area up and make it more pleasing to the modern tourist, right? Newport, to me, in my head, in my canon for it, in a sense, I would imagine this city focuses a lot on tourism because I want to add hotels to some parts of the city, again, a little bit ways away, but I wanted to have more of a focus in tourism, specifically in national tourism of the fictional country that it's in, and all of that kind of thing. So I really wanted to emphasize this idea of like various renewal projects along the waterfront to try to preserve historical buildings. As you'll see, there's like kind of colonial architecture occasionally popping up near the waterfront, because this is where the colonial settlement would have been back in the days, on the south side of the island, which is why it's also going to be a lot more like old industrial. You also notice that there's a lot of really new buildings along the waterfront, which I imagine are buildings that would have been built post 70s, right? Post 70s, on top of what would have been old warehouses that would have looked like the colonial buildings, or that, the brown one, like, with that ends up, I think now I've decided it's like a Maritime Museum, which is why it has that weird like bulbousy thing on it. It's kind of strange looking. I'm not watching it along with you, so I hope you've seen it, but maybe you haven't. I guess the time will tell, but if you haven't, you'll see it, and if you have, then you know what I'm talking about. But I imagine that it is, that's a Maritime Museum, so it's a little bit modern. It takes an old warehouse that would have been there for a long time, long before cargo containers were invented, but then was left abandoned for a long time and then reclaimed by the, either by the city or a private investor in order to build a museum there. Right, so you can imagine a lot of projects like that, but it is something you need to think about, right? What architecture are you going to have on your waterfront? Because how the history of your waterfront looks is going to change that. Because like I said, the history of my waterfront is that it was very industrial until cargo containers were invented. The industry left a lot of abandoned buildings that then, after the 70s, slowly got built up with various skyscrapers filling in the space until modern day, where they started reclaiming a lot of that old architecture that was still left over and trying to make something out of it, right? Make it pretty. And of course, that means that I'm limited in architectural styles to post 70s for my waterfront area, for the most part, right? Go a block or two back and I'm okay with having some larger, older buildings, because I could imagine that the industry wouldn't have gone too far into the island. Most of the factories would have been near the coast because there wasn't trains, so you wanted short trips, from the port itself to the factories and back again to import and export goods. You wouldn't want long trips on horse and buggy. So most of the factories would have been near the coast. We might build some more like train-based infrastructure again in the future on the southern side of the river, so not in Newport itself. I think I call it Winsdale is the city that's on the southern side of this river, of the waterfront we're on right now. And that is, to me, probably is going to have a lot more industry, right? It's going to have a modern cargo port, and it's going to have a lot more like train infrastructure and things like that. So be on the lookout for that. Maybe we'll come back to this topic a little bit then. But yeah, I just really wanted to iterate how important it is. If you're designing a city, history really does matter, because if you want it to be realistic, the only way to do that is to think through, how does this make sense? Right? Because if I came up with this story of how the port looks, but then let's say I built train infrastructure, like piers, right along this waterfront, it wouldn't make any sense, because where would the trains be coming from? Like, sure, they may have run along the waterfront at what point, but like, why aren't they there now? And like, how would I come up, that, in a sense, it doesn't make any sense. Why would trains be here when this would have already existed as a colony a long time before then? They wouldn't have the space to necessarily accommodate that. Some places made space, right? You look at London, right? Obviously London was built without trains for many hundreds of years, and then they just proceeded to demolish entire sections of city in order to build trains. Same with Paris. A lot of cities have done this throughout history. Of course, America famously did this with the highways. This isn't a new thing just for us. It's been done throughout history for a very long time. When these new transit options get invented, they have to kind of make space for them, and it's not always in the nicest of ways. But it's something to think about, because if you do want to have a city with that kind of history, right, where they tore out blocks to build train lines or highways or whatever, you have to have evidence of that. You have to be able to build that literally into the story so people can see it and recognize it. But with that, I'm going to leave the episode there. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I had a lot of fun making it. I've had a lot of fun recording this one. This is the first time I've tried scripting out an episode, so maybe you noticed that. I had my intro vaguely written out, and I had bullet points of everything I wanted to talk about so that I didn't run off the rails too much. Haha, rails. Not really an intended pun, but there you go. But anyways, I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I will see you not next week, but the week after, at the very least. Maybe I'll see you next week. If you're lucky, you'll get to see me next week. But until then, until you see each other again, well, we don't really see each other until you listen to my voice again, maybe in a week, maybe 2 weeks. Have a good one, and goodbye.